In the last section, we finished up an initial implementation of our news API provider. However, we don't really have any application to test this with just yet. Yeah, of course, we could write a little bit of code inside of our lib main.dart file, which was automatically generated for us, to create a new instance of the news provider and try to make a request, but we'll be deleting that code very shortly as soon as we start to work on our actual application. So rather than putting together some very temporary code inside this generated app to make sure this stuff is working the way we expect, I think it might be a good time right now to get a better idea of how to test code that we write with Dart's and Flutter's built-in testing packages. So you might have noticed throughout the last couple applications that we've put together that whenever we have generated a new project, we got this test directory automatically created for us. And inside of here is a file called widgettest.dart. So this is, as it says at the top right here, a very basic test for a widget that is created inside of our application. In particular, this test is looking at the default counter application and kind of making sure that tapping on that plus icon actually increments the counter on the screen. So this is a test intended to make sure that a widget inside of our application is working correctly. I'm going to propose that we try to make a very similar test that just makes sure that the two functions that we've created on this news API provider work the way we expect. And so we can kind of test this stuff without having to write some code that we're going to very quickly have to delete. So with that in mind, let's learn a little bit about testing. So here's the general idea. At present, we have a news API provider.dart file. There's a single class inside there with two functions of fetch top IDs and fetch item. So to test this class right here, we're going to make a file called the exact same name of news API provider, but we're going to add on to the end of the file name _test right here. Adding on the _test is very important, and I'll show you why in just a moment. Then inside that file, we're going to define a main function, and inside that main function, we're going to write some number of test statements to make sure that these functions over here work the way that we expect them to work. So in particular, we're going to make sure that calling fetch top IDs returns a list of IDs, and we're going to make sure that calling fetch item returns an instance of a item model. So let's flip back over to our code editor. We're going to create this new test file. So back inside of my code editor, I'm going to find my test directory. And then one thing that I personally like to do, this is not necessarily something done by the entire community, but this is something that I like to do, and it is something that is done very frequently in other languages. I like to have a directory structure inside of test that mirrors the structure of my lib directory. And so what that allows me to do is to say, oh, I want to find the test file for something inside of src resources. I could then go directly into test and find the same folders inside there and easily find the test file I'm looking for. Again, not huge community convention here. You'll even notice that the default test file is called widget test, clearly not mirroring main.dart right here. So kind of a little personal preference here, but you can definitely fiddle with this stuff a little bit if you'd like. So inside of test, I'm going to make a new folder called src, and I'm going to make a new folder inside of src called resources. And then inside of there, I'm going to place the test file to test the code that we had written inside of news API provider.dart. So inside the resources directory, I'm going to make a new file called news API provider. And then remember, we're going to add onto the end of the name right here, test.dart, like so. So the reason that we put on _test right here is because when we execute the test runner, or the program that is going to run all of our testing code, that test runner is going to find our test directory and then try to find every file inside of here that has a name ending in _test. So if we don't put that in the name, then our test file will not be found and it will not be executed, which is obviously not ideal. Okay, so we got our test file put together. Let's take a quick pause. We'll come back to the next section and start adding some tests to this thing. In the last section, we created a new test file specifically made to test the class that we'd put together inside of news API provider.dart. So now inside of here, we're going to write out some amount of code that's going to look at the class we just put together and make sure that these functions are returning the values that we would expect. So in particular, I want to see fetch top IDs return an actual list of IDs, and I want to see fetch item return an item model for some given ID. So let's figure out how we're going to do that inside of our test file. To get started, as you might imagine, we're going to need to import the class that we want to test. So I'm going to import that file of newsAPIProvider.dart. Now, one thing I want to remind you about with import statements is that there are 3 different types of import statements with Dart. We've got files that you and I write, we've got Dart standard library packages, and we've got third-party packages that we import as well. Now, the kind of trick to importing files that you and I create is that if we are inside of our lib directory, so if we're inside of a file inside of our lib directory and we are importing another file that is written inside of our lib directory, we provide a relative reference to that other file. However, here's the catch. If we are trying to import a file inside the lib directory from a file that is not inside of lib, which is the case of our API provider test file right here, then we do not use a relative reference. So to import news API provider, we're not going to use a relative reference, even though it is a file we created, because we are importing from outside of the lib directory. So to get at news API provider right here, we're going to import our file as though it were part of a third-party package. So I'm going to write out package, and then the name of our project, which for me is news, because that's the name of the project that I supplied when I ran that flutter create command at the terminal. If you do not remember what you called your project, you can always open up your pubspec.yaml file, and the name of your project will be listed right here. Now, when we add on package and then the name of our project news, we can then imagine that that starts us off inside of our lib directory. So this import statement as it stands right now, it's kind of at the lib directory, and now we have to write out a path inside of lib. So I want to get at news API provider, so I'm going to go into the src directory, and then resources, and then get that file. So inside there, I'm going to go inside the src folder. I'm going to go into resources, and then I'll get the news API provider.dart. Okay, tricky little import statement there. Now there's going to be 1 or 2 or 3 other packages that we're going to have to import, so we'll just bring them in right now rather than having to jump back up to the top of this file nonstop. So at some point, we are going to have to work with a little bit of JSON data inside this file as a part of the test that we're going to write. So I'm going to import Dart convert right away. We're also going to need a little bit of code from a package called test. And we're going to get the test.dart file out of there. So as you might guess, this package right here has a ton of helper functions associated with it to help you and I write tests for our code. Now, 2 other quick imports. Again, I just want to kind of get these out of the way right now. We're going to import the HTTP module. And then we're also going to import that testing file out of that HTTP module that I very briefly mentioned previously. So if you recall back over at the documentation for HTTP package, you see how there's libraries over here. This listing of libraries is a reference to all the different files out of this package that we can import. And so we just imported the http.dart file. And so everything inside that .dart file corresponds to the code inside of kind of like this section of the library. So for testing any of our code that makes use of the HTTP package, we very frequently want to also import this testing file as well. And so this testing file, or this testing part of the HTTP library, has some code inside of it that makes testing code that you and I write that makes use of HTTP requests much, 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 much easier. So we're going to also import this testing.dart file. Okay, so back over here, I'll import package HTTP testing.dart, like so. Okay, so again, just wanted to kind of get through all those import statements right away so we didn't have to keep coming back up here to the top. Let's take another quick break. We'll come back to the next section and we'll start writing out our first test. in the last section, we wrote out a crazy number of import statements, and now we're ready to actually start putting together some tests inside this file. So inside of every test file that you and I put together, we're always going to define a main function, which is actually kind of interesting if you think about it. Remember, any given Dart program only is allowed to have one main function. So whenever you and I start to put together test files, every test file has its own main function, which kind of implies that every test file is its own separate Dart program. So every test file we put together, it's kind of its own little isolated program inside of this test directory. I don't know, just kind of interesting. So inside of here, we'll define our main function. And then we're not going to worry about testing the news provider just yet. Just to get started, I just want to show you how to write out a very simple, a very basic test. So inside of here, we're going to use a function coming from the test package that we had just imported. That function is called test. So the test function essentially defines a new thing that we want to test inside of our application. The first argument to the test function is going to be a string that is a description of the test that we want to write. So the first thing that you and I are probably going to want to test is to make sure that inside of our news API provider, we want to make sure that our fetch top IDs function right here actually returns a list of IDs. So for the test description, I'll say something like fetch top IDs returns a list of IDs. These descriptions right here are solely for your benefit and my benefit. So there's nothing about the testing framework that tries to do anything too special about them. So again, give descriptions that are effective for you to read. Then as a second argument to the test function, we're going to pass in a function that's going to be the actual code that we're going to execute to test something about our project. So inside of here, we'll typically do like some setup of test case. You know, maybe we will create a new instance of the news API provider, which we definitely have to do, and then we'll attempt to call the fetch top IDs function. After we do that some setup, we'll then finally do something called an expectation. And the purpose of an expectation is to make sure that some value that was produced by our application is essentially what we expect it to be. So rather than doing the actual news API provider here to start, let's say that you and I have some code that's going to add together two numbers. So let's create a variable here called sum, and that'll be like 1 plus 3. So maybe this is the code right here that we want to test. So we just did some little bit of setup, and then we'll write out the actual expectation to make sure that sum is what we expect it to be. So to write out an expectation, we're going to call the expect function. The expect function is another function that is a part of the test library. The first argument to it is going to be some value that we are getting from our application. So something that we want to test. So in our case, that's going to be sum. That's the thing that we want to make sure has the correct value. And then the second argument will be the value that we expect it to be, or essentially the value that we want to see coming out of our code. So the second argument, I'll put in 4, because that's what I want sum to be. So now we'll run this test suite. So I'm going to first save the file. I'll then flip back over to my terminal, and I'm going to open up a second terminal window inside of my project directory. So you'll notice I have two terminal windows open right now. I still have one that's running my Flutter run process, and I've opened up a second window inside the same news directory, and I'm going to run the tests inside of this window. So to actually run my tests, I'll execute flutter test, like so. Now the one thing about testing with Dart that I personally am not super happy about, this is kind of like the downside of testing with Dart, it takes a long time for tests to run. Very unfortunate. I really don't care for it. I wish it was faster. Unfortunately, it's not. So in our case, we have the built-in test, that kind of widget test that we get for free automatically. And then we've got the news API provider test as well, which is just making sure that 4 is 4. And running all that stuff took me 13 seconds. Now, of course, I am running video recording software, so it's a little bit slower for me. For you, it might be something like 4, 5, 6, 7 seconds, depending on your hardware. To me personally, that still seems a little bit slow. I don't know. Like I said, it's just my one small complaint. But more importantly, hey, our tests are passing. Okay, so we've now seen essentially what we do for a test here. So we're going to do a little bit of setup, to kind of produce some value, and it'll write out an expectation to make sure that value is what we expect it to be. So enough of this kind of introduction level stuff. Let's take a quick pause. We'll come back to the next section, and we're going to actually create a new instance of our news API provider and make sure that calling top IDs returns the IDs that we expect to see. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In this section, we're going to start to write out our real test for the fetch top IDs function. So inside of here, I'm going to delete the kind of little test code or sample code we had previously, and then we'll immediately dive in by creating a new instance of the news API provider class. So back over here inside my test, I'm going to say final news API is news API provider. So then inside of here, we might try to directly call the fetch top IDs function and let that make a real request over to the Hacker News API. But quick thing I want to mention about that. Okay, so here's a diagram of what's happening inside of our API provider class right now. We've got fetch top IDs and fetch item, and they're both relying upon client.get to make a real request to the Hacker News API. Now the issue with this is that in a test environment, we generally prefer to not have our code make any requests to outside APIs. And there's two good reasons for this. On the first hand, or the first reason, anytime we make a network request, it takes some amount of time. And so if we have many tests inside of our project, we don't want to have to be waiting for a ton of these requests to make a lot of these tests to make a real request to some outside API. It just means it's going to take our tests longer to run. In addition, if this Hacker News API ever temporarily goes down, well then we'll be essentially in a state where we can't even run our tests because our tests will be trying to access that API that we cannot access. The other big reason that we don't like to allow our tests to make real HTTP requests is that we never quite know what data we're going to get back from this API. Today it might be for fetch top IDs, and it might be a list of like the 50 top topics or the 50 top IDs. Tomorrow it might be for some reason a list of 40 IDs. Maybe they changed their API. And so in general, we prefer not to reach out to real APIs when we are writing tests. So in order to still write an effective test, we're going to be making use of a package inside, or a submodule of the HTTP package that we looked at very briefly called the testing library. So inside my HTTP package documentation right here on the testing library page, and inside of here is a class called mock client. So this is why we had created an instance of client inside of our news API provider rather than directly using the get function as we did previously. So we created an instance of client right here and assign it to an instance variable on our news API provider. Now to test our code, we're going to take that instance of the client library that we just created, and we're going to instead replace it with an instance of the mock client. So this mock client is essentially a testing version of that client class. Whenever we make use of mock client, if we try to run some code that executes a request, the request never actually goes to some outside API. There's no actual network request completed. Instead, the mock client will essentially instantly complete the request for us. And so that makes it a perfect use case for writing out tests. It solves both the two issues that we were running into earlier. Number one, the request gets instantly completed, so it doesn't slow down our tests. Number two, you and I have the ability to control the data that gets returned from the mock client. So essentially what you and I are going to do inside of our news API provider test file right here, we're going to create a new instance of mock client, and we're going to say, hey, mock client, anytime someone tries to use you to make a request, just return this preset list of IDs. We'll then call fetch top IDs right here. The mock client will be used, so we're essentially going to, in the testing world, replace this little bit right here. The mock client is going to be used to make that request. The mock client is going to instantly return that JSON data that we specify, and then we're going to essentially test to make sure that fetch top IDs correctly parses that JSON data and returns the list back to us. So let's give this a shot. Back inside of my test file, I'm going to define a new instance of mock client. Now mock client is going to take a single argument. It's going to be a function, and this function gets invoked anytime our code tries to make a legitimate request. So in other words, when client.get back over here is executed, rather than making the real request, this function right here is going to be executed. And then whatever you and I return from this function is going to be returned from this request over here. So again, we're kind of short-circuiting this entire request process. Now this function itself gets called with an object that we refer to as the request object. And it has some information about the request that our code is trying to issue. And so the request object right here probably has some information about, say, maybe the URL that we are trying to make the request to. In our case, we don't really care about this request object too much. Now, if you wanted to, you absolutely could inspect this request object and make sure that a request is being issued to the URL that you would expect. That would be a totally viable expectation to write inside of a test, but not quite what we mean to do. Okay, we're running a little bit long here, so let's take a very brief pause. We're going to come back in the next section and fill out this mock client function. In the last section, we started putting together our mock client instance right here. Again, this function right here is going to be invoked anytime our code tries to create a AJAX or a HTTP request. So whatever we return from this function will be what our code thinks that it's getting back from that outside API. So what you and I have to do inside of here is return some amount of JSON data. So I'm going to create a fake list of IDs. So this is going to be like a fake list that we're going to later on expect gets returned from calling the fetch top IDs function. So I'm going to create a new list of IDs. I'll put in like 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I'm going to turn that into JSON data by calling json.encode. Now, if we try to return this, we're going to get an error message. So if you hover over the error, you'll notice that we are currently trying to return something of type string, because that's what JSON is. It is a string. But it is expected that from this function, you and I are going to return a future that contains a response. So even though, all this stuff might seem like it's really easy to craft some data that gets returned, well, this function has very specific requirements. We have to return a response object that contains the data that we want to send back to our API. So this response object right here is a part of the HTTP package. So this represents a real response that is going to be directly handed back to our code back inside of the real fetch top IDs function. The first argument to the response constructor is the JSON that we want to be inside the response. And then the second argument to it is going to be the status code of the request, or excuse me, of the response. And so we're going to enter in a status code of 200 to indicate that, hey, everything is successful and everything's good. Now, even when we add in a response right here, you'll notice that we still have this kind of red error message right here. So we are now returning a response, but we need to return a future that's going to resolve with a response. And to solve this, all we have to do is mark this function as async, like so. Okay, so that creates the mock client. Now, here's kind of the twist here. Just creating the mock client doesn't do anything. This creates a mock client, and it just kind of sits there. This thing does not automatically intercept requests that are made. We have to actually go back to the news API provider, the instance that we had created, which was technically right here, and we're going to replace the client that we had initialized on here with the fake client or the mock client that we just put together. So back inside of our test, when we create the mock client, I'm going to say newsapi.client equals mock client. So now hopefully it makes a little bit more sense as to why we made use of the client as an instance variable on here rather than directly using the get function. It's because we wanted to make use of the mock client class, and we wanted to specifically overwrite the client instance on our news provider API instance variable. So now, after setting all that stuff up, we can now attempt to call the fetch top IDs function and get back the list of IDs that that function is supposed to retrieve from the API. So for this, I'm going to create a new variable called IDs, and then I'll call news API dot fetch top IDs. Oops, capital I. Now this is a function that's going to return a future. Remember, a future is like a JavaScript promise. Essentially, we have to wait for this thing to be resolved, even though we're making use of the mock client. So even though we're making use of the mock client, the request is kind of instantaneous, but to make sure that our code doesn't break by instantly returning a value, because remember back over here, we do have the await keyword. So whenever we call fetch top ID is right here, even though it does instantaneously complete the request, we still are going to pretend as though it takes some amount of time. And so I'm going to put in the await keyword in front of it. Now you'll notice that I'm getting an error message right there. It's because we are making use of await inside of a function that is not marked as async. So I'm going to make sure that I mark this thing as async like so. Okay, so now last thing we have to do, we're going to look at this list of IDs and we're going to write out an expectation to make sure that it is equal to the list of IDs that we had kind of faked to come back from the API. So I'll say expect IDs to be equal to 1, 2, 3, and 4, like so. And that's it. So let's save this file. I'll flip back over to my command line. I'll do a Flutter test. And then we're going to wait the 12 seconds. Hopefully for you, it's like 3 to 6 seconds or so. I could always delete the widget test file and it would go a little bit faster, but whatever, we'll get through it. And there we go, test pass. Awesome. Okay, so that's pretty much it for testing a asynchronous function that makes a network request. Let's take a quick pause. And to be honest with you, I know it might be a little bit laborious. I would like to write a test around fetch item right here as well. So let's take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll very quickly put together a test for this function as well. So I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we finished up our fetch top IDs test right here. I now want to write out a second test that's going to make sure that our fetch item function works the way we expect. And so now that we get the general idea of what we're doing here, we can write out this next test much more quickly. The code we're going to write is going to be just about identical to what we have right here, so it should go pretty fast. All right, so to get started, I'm going to first begin by writing out a second test function. And I'm going to give this thing a description of something like fetch item returns a item model. Because remember, our expectation is that anytime we call fetch item, we're going to eventually get back this item model instance that we had created. So inside of here, we'll first begin by creating another instance of the news API. I'll then again create a new mock client and overwrite the client property on our news API. Then I'll pass a function into the mock client that gets called with our request. Inside there, I'm going to return a response that has some encoded data. So in the last case, we were returning a list of records. In this case, we're trying to represent something that represents a single individual item model. And so in the kind of Dart world, to represent a JavaScript object, we create a map. Remember, a map is like a JavaScript object or a Ruby hash where we have some string keys and then we have values associated with each one. And so in our case, maybe we'll define this map ahead of time just so we can see it a little bit more easily. So on the line right above, I'll create something that I'll just call JSON map. And so this is going to be the JSON that represents an individual item that we're trying to fetch from the API. And so maybe we'll just give this thing an ID property of like 1, 2, 3, like so. So this right here is the item that we're trying to fetch from the API. Remember that, of course, this thing has many other properties associated with it. Like here's the result of a real API request to the endpoint that we're testing right now. And so it has all these other properties, but for the purposes of our test, I think just testing to make sure that the ID shows up properly is probably enough. So there's our JSON map. Then we're going to encode this thing. We're going to pass that as the first argument or the first constructor argument to response. And then remember, the second argument will be the status response code. And then we also have to mark this function as async. So now, after doing all that setup, I will create a new variable for something I'll call, how about rather than model, we'll call it item. So this should be an instance of an item model that comes back from calling our fetch item function right here. So I'll do news API.fetch item, and I have to pass in an ID. So maybe I'll pass in an ID of 123. You know what? Rather than 123, let's just do like 999. I wouldn't want to pass in 123 right here because you'll notice that I am passing in, or our response object has an ID of 123. And right now our test is not actually trying to make sure that like we're fetching the correct ID. We definitely could modify the test to do that, but I would not want to put 123 right here because that would make it seem like we were trying to make an assertion for that. So now that we've got the item back, we can do expect the item ID. So this is the ID property on the ID item model class instance, and we're going to make sure that thing is equal to the value 123 because that's what's being returned from our actual JSON up here. Now, one last thing I neglected inside of here, we need to make sure that we put the await keyword in front of fetch item right here for the same reason as last time. And when we put await here, we need to also make sure we mark the enclosing function as async as well. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Let's try running this one as well. And we'll wait just a couple of seconds here. I know, oh, it takes forever. It's like 12, 13 seconds. I am sure half of you are thinking, why doesn't he use video editing to speed this up? Well, it's because I like to tell funny jokes while we wait. I don't have a joke this time. Next time I'll have a joke ready, don't worry. Okay, anyways, all tests pass, and we now have 3 passing tests inside of our application. So I now have reasonable belief to say that, yes, in fact, our news API provider class is working the way we expect. So let's take a pause. When we come back to the next section, we'll continue working on all this data setup stuff by taking a shot at our news database provider, which you recall is going to be our interface to that SQLite database that's going to cache a ton of fetched items on our device directly. So quick pause, and we'll take care of that in the next section.